Everybody, welcome back to the Insiders Lounge. Today we have another special episode and another special guest. John, thank you for joining me and feel free to introduce yourself.
Thank you for having me. Hi, everyone. John Guagliano. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for Minnesota United FC. I've been here since October 2016, so for their transition into MLS.
So normally the guests that we have on the show, we kind of focus the intersection of soccer and business. A lot of those people coming from a soccer background, but I know you kind of we'll get into it later on. But you got a real mixed backgrounds in terms of sport, in terms of experience for yourself. But I want to go back to your earliest just sporting memory in general. Where was it for you? Like for young John, what was he getting into? What was he getting started with in the sports world as a whole?
Well, both my parents are from Italy, so I don't think I had a choice when it came to playing this game. So that was it. But I had an older brother, 2 years older. And I would say it didn't matter. If it was a ball, a puck, a bird, it didn't matter. We were going to play. And we would make up our own games. A pillow, where you'd be running like with footballs in the house kind of thing. Like you name it, dribbling. Inside, we pretty much broke everything. Like we were like the atypical, aggressive boys that, like, I still don't know how my mom survived.
And so we were just discussing it actually before the recording. You grew up in New Jersey, obviously the Italian background, like you mentioned. Can we get an idea of like what your childhood and kind of upbringing actually looked like, and maybe some hints to see? Like I always like to know. You got into obviously sports marketing later on. Was there hints early on where you could see yourself like, okay, maybe this is a role I wanted to get into, or just some ideas of like, okay, I started marketing early on, like I did some sort of marketing and I was interested in sports, like that kind of like tie it into what you're doing now.
Yeah, like it was interesting. My upbringing, it was very blue collar, right? Like my dad owned an auto body shop. My mom pretty much worked two jobs. So like hard work was just normal. Like you didn't consider it hard work. I don't know. Like that's just how you were, right? Like, we built, like if we had to do a shed in the backyard, we didn't go out to Home Depot, we would build it, right? Like we would build the shed. And so, there was a lot of hands-on, a lot of entrepreneurial kind of, thing. And I really didn't start thinking about marketing until college. And I didn't think about working in sports until after college. And, that's interesting, right? Like when you think about like how people are specializing it today and now they have sports marketing degrees. And I mean, I thought I was going to be stockbroker on Wall Street, right? My brother was in banking. It's kind of like followed his footsteps. And boy, I was like, this is just not for me. I just can't. So I ended up reading, this book. And in the end, this is like after I graduated, and it said like, and I still didn't have a job. I was just working part-time. And I built a list. On one side of it is like everything you love doing. And then on the other side is like how you turn it into a job, right? Like what is the job? So with this list, it was like, sports, outdoor, sports, right? Like, so I'm like, okay, I guess I'm one-dimensional right now. I think I know what I like doing. And then I just tried to figure out how to make it a job from there. It was kind of like, that's how I ended up in sports, right? It's like, and it is true, like, you have to do this for the rest of your life. Do you like it? And that's kind of like,
Yeah.
I think that was kind of my mentality. It's not about like, every job is normal. It doesn't matter if it's the greatest job in the world, starting out. There's going to be something you don't like about it, right? Like there's going to be something that goes wrong. But in the end, you got to like what you're doing, right? It's almost like playing. Like I played soccer in college. I played in high school. You don't always have a good game, but that doesn't mean you're going to leave, right? Like you just got to figure out like, how do you get the next game to be better?
Yeah, it's a good perspective. You mentioned your parents there, so I want to quickly get what is like one key thing you learned from each of your parents, and then we'll get into your first role and so on in the industry.
I would probably say my mom's a superhero. Like there's no doubt about that. Like she, you know, my dad was always working and she worked two jobs. She worked, during the day she did, helped him out with the books. And then she worked from like 3 to midnight. So I would probably say like from her, it's, loyalty, and like always having your back, right? Like I don't think you learn a lot when it doesn't matter if you get yelled at, but you know you're loved, right? Like in an Italian family, you're getting yelled at a lot.
Yeah.
So, and then my dad is just like beast mode grinder worker, like, you know, 7 to 7 kind of thing. And, you know, I used to joke with my son that, you know, if he's, you know, I said, if you were me and you slept past 7:30, you would be considered lazy growing up. I said, what does 10 o'clock mean? What does 11 o'clock mean? And he would laugh because he knows my parents and he loves them and everything. And he's like, it's like two different worlds. You know, my wife calls it boot camp Guagliano anytime they come over because they're coming in to do work on the house. Like when we first bought the house, it wasn't like, where are we going to dinner? My dad was coming down with the toolbox, and we weren't doing small projects. We were putting front porches on the house, and we were like doing things like that, like a whole new kitchen, and he would do it in a weekend. Like I said, beast mode.
My dad was in the South African military, and it was the same. Like everything, I was like, Dad, not everything has to be like a military operation. Like whether it was like making breakfast in the morning or doing homework, like everything was like super just strict and like on the ball. And I was like, no, like we can just relax and do something together. Like it doesn't have to be. So I can relate with that. But I wanted to get into kind of your breakthrough, or like the first open door getting into the sports kind of marketing space, but just the sports industry as a whole.
Yeah.
What was that for you, and how did that come about?
So when after I graduated, you know, it wasn't the best time. You know, unemployment rate was high, and so you're looking, right? Like New York, Boston, DC, everything was like 10%, 20%, 15% unemployment rate. And then going to school in Virginia, University of Lynchburg, small school, a lot of people were either going to like Atlanta or DC, right? But then everybody started talking about Charlotte. And so I looked up Charlotte. The unemployment rate in Charlotte was really low. I'm like, oh, they had the Charlotte Hornets. They were only there for a few years. So I tried that and didn't have a shot. Like didn't respond to anything. Or if they did respond, it was a very generic letter. And I actually saved the letter and showed it to the lady who, when I got the job later, and she started laughing. She goes, "Oh boy, you were a pain in the you know what." And I'm like, "Good, thank you." But so the foot in the door was the owner of the Hornets, George Shin, owned a minor league baseball team. I think it was Double A at the time. They were moving to Triple, and I was thinking, like, is there a way to go there? Almost like use it as a minor league system and then go, you know, and so I had this, you know, this plan, and I reached out to the general manager, who's really nice, Bill Lavelle. He told me he didn't have anything. And then, then I still kept in touch. He sent me another note. I guess they were talking about doing inside sales, you know, commission only. I said, sure. Right. Like I could do that. So I got a job in a bar at night, and then did that during the day. So he hired me that way. But, I didn't know this, but his wife worked for the Hornets. So, and she worked in the training facility. So that's kind of like, and then the mascot used to work out at the training facility. He was a gymnast, former gymnast, right? Like, and all those things. So that's where he would train. He would practice his dunks and everything. And I guess she told her husband about, like, he was looking for somebody to help, you know, it's a full-time job. And I don't know why he came to me, because I didn't sell a damn thing, right? Like I was, you know, commission only, Double A baseball. I mean, but I showed up every day. It's probably why, you know what I mean? Like I showed up every day, and I came in with a positive attitude, and he recommended me for it, and I got the job. So it's like I had zero connections moving to Charlotte, but it was because of connections that I got the job.
Yeah, it's funny. I always say that your network is sort of the greatest value that you can have connected to you. It's so key. I want to get into, you've sort of done, I would say 4 out of the 5 major sports, especially in the US. I think you only missed out on the NFL, right? Yeah. You haven't covered that yet.
Pretty much.
Maybe at one point in your career you can still get there. But can we sort of dive into each different league and kind of go into what, like, sort of their marketing strategy and what makes them different compared to the other sports? So I think if you want to start off with the or you can start off even with the MLB and sort of baseball as a whole, starting with the Double A and sort of the minor leagues.
Well, I didn't spend
get
too
into
much time
kind of
in
what
minors.
Makes.
So
it was
about 2 months, but I'll start kind of with the progression. So,
Yeah, that'd be
and it's
great.
also, it was different points in my career, which is always interesting, right? Like different stages. Um, NBA was interesting, like in a positive way, like very business schoolish, right? From the front office down, really good about sharing information. Probably, at least at the time, I'm not sure if it's still the same, but at the time, it was definitely the most sophisticated, right? And creative on the marketing side of things. Um, NHL was a little bit of a breath of fresh air from the NBA. And what I mean by that is like maybe not as much support from the league, but a little bit more freedom, right? Like, but you really good relationships. There was a lot of lifers in hockey. Hockey reminds me a lot of kind of like the soccer world, where a lot of the people that are working there are like loved the game, played the game, grew up, everything about the game. So that was interesting. But me not, I played a little bit. I played some pond hockey in New Jersey. My friends played, but I was kind of an outsider when it came to that, for the most part. Then I kind of went back to the NBA in a higher role. And again, that's when you really see the support from the league, right? Like, and you can kind of really feel like how their team bow is hands on and works with teams, but very cookie cutter. Like they're okay if every team use the exact same playbook, right? Like and the creativity probably comes from other parts, based on your presentation, your fan base, what type of players you have, your market. But it's like very kind of cookie cutter ish. Major League Baseball is a grind, both on and off the field, and you are really a lifer there. Like that is a lifestyle beyond a lifestyle. You're either working 14 straight games or you're preparing for 14 straight games, right? Like,
Wow.
um, but from a marketing standpoint, like what's nice about it is you have a game almost every day. So you have a new idea. You can put a lot of time in those ideas, and if it doesn't go well, you're just like, okay, we're just going to move on because now we got another game. Everybody's going to forget by tomorrow, kind of thing, right? Like where, then you get into soccer, and maybe not the same as the NFL, but only 34 home games officially, 34 total games, right? Like,
Right.
um, I used to joke that in baseball, 1 month we played a full season, right? We played about 28 games in 1 month. Like you would have, so think about that, right? When you have 34 in a season. Now, granted, you have all these tournaments, the Open Cup, Leagues Cup,
Mhm.
friendlies, things like that. So it does get a little bit more than that. But I think that the nice thing about that, though, is you have a little bit more time to prepare for each and put a little bit more into each. Now, that being said, where baseball, you can move on easily. When you don't have as many, it's harder to move on, right? Like, kind of sits with you a little bit longer, whether it's a loss or something didn't go well. Because you may have 2 weeks before you get to, redeem yourself, so to speak. So I would say in sports, short-term memory is probably really important, not just on the field.
Yeah, no, well said. And then comparing that, I wanted to compare it to European soccer because I know that's kind of a space now where, especially in the role you're in today, that's a big topic of conversation because they're on the European side, they're trying to improve to more commercialized things like the US, and the US is trying to bring the level of play
Right.
like Europe has. So it's kind of this back and forth. So I'm curious how you compare kind of the American commercialized sort of marketing space to what Europe has and kind of how they can learn from each other.
Yeah, I think obviously the principles are the same, right? You have something that you're trying to sell or something you're trying to grow, right? And a lot of you can look at it the same way in the U.S. A lot of the top teams that are historically that have been around for 50 to 100 years, their brand is pretty much built, right? Like maybe they kind of live on their past a little bit, but what ends up happening is like if you don't invest, whether if the team's not playing well or something bad happens, the interest goes down. And I think in Europe they're probably feeling that. Not to mention with the salaries, right? Like once you get the salaries with these players, you're realizing how much more you need, and you need to be on all cylinders to execute. Whether it's for partners, whether it's for season ticket members, people's expectations, because they're spending a lot of money, whether partners or fans. So it's like, what type of experience are you going to give them? It's like fan, brand, culture, community, and revenue, right? Like those are the key things that you're focusing on as you're building it. And in Europe, they're just start getting into that side, and they're doing a great job because they've got the TV money, in most of their games. Now it's like, what are we going to do? How do we enhance that, right? Like they've got pretty much some salaries paid for with that TV. Now it's like they got the tickets. Where's the open thing? Is it digital? Is it partnership? That's usually the one that you can kind of grow. Everything else has a cap to it, so to speak, right? Like there's only so many seats in the building, and you're only
Yeah.
going to get so much from TV. So now it's like, how do we grow this area in the middle? That in stadium events too are probably like the big things, and that's where you can't just do it when you have a PR person doing 6 jobs. It just doesn't work anymore to execute because of the expectations of both fans and partners.
And do you see, like, where do you see the space in terms of what league or sport do you see putting the most time and effort into that space? Like actually investing in, hey, we need more people here working on X. Like, where do you see the kind of the sport or league that's doing the best at that? That's really trying to push that into a kind of the next few years.
I think NFL's doing a great job. They're the beast mode thing. They probably have the most defined positions, and I would say MLS has the least defined positions. And what I mean by that is like you wear many hats in a smaller business, right? Like in bigger business, you may wear one hat and you have one focus, right? So right now, if you look at like NFL, like they don't just have social people; they have social people that are their job is just to focus on what they're doing for partners, right?
Yeah.
Like, and then they have social people that are just focusing on the community or um, or on field. So they're a little bit more, specific, job specific, which is both good and bad, right? Like there's something to be said, from a learning standpoint. If you can get in with a smaller league, I mean, I love hiring people from the minors because I know that they probably were on the grounds crew one day and, selling sponsorships the next, right? Like, so it's that hard work and roll up your sleeves mentality that's always nice. It's that entrepreneurial where you just don't, you're just not giving somebody an idea and telling them to run with it. You're actually part of it. You're helping with it.
And do you think that comes from like a long-term thing of just like the NFL being around for longer, or is it the size of the league or where they're at financially? Like, what do you think is the biggest factor there?
I think it's the TV deals and the size of the league itself, right? Like they have it down. They have such and there's so much at stake but they can also focus more on the other stuff. They know they've got this money coming in. So like this bucket is maxed out, right? Like they're good about that. Now they're figuring out how do they max out the other buckets. How do they, concerts? You can see all these concerts that are going on in football stadiums and big concerts, not just, they're not just doing like, holiday parties and things like that, as events. They're doing major events. And, even in like warm places or cool places, they're putting domes in so it could be 24/7. So they don't have to worry about, the weather when they're doing their events. That's important. So that's how they're maximizing it is because of that growth. And they've also done a great job with their flag football, how that actually made it into the Olympics. And because there was a concern there, I think, on the NFL side, like football was one dimensional, US, US, US. Now all of a sudden it's becoming a global sport.
And it was dying at the youth levels. Like I think slowly you were seeing soccer, basketball, even baseball taking over at the youth levels. Now you're starting to see kind of a resurgence with parents saying, okay, if it's flag football, then we can understand why, and it's not going to be as detrimental to our kids.
They have flag football high school teams now. Like
really, I didn't even know that.
It's crazy.
So then I wanted to get into, you mentioned kind of the lifer aspect, that some people just really enjoyed a certain sport and decided to stay in that league or at that team. For you, why change? Why move on and get into different roles?
Yeah, I think some of it had to do with growth. Like, at the time it was like you don't move up, you move on. And because I wasn't from those markets, it was a little easier. Like it wasn't my home, right? Like if it was, my hometown and my hometown team, it's a little bit like, this is where I'm from, this is where I'm always going to be, that's what I care about. Because I wasn't from those areas, and if an opportunity came along and it seemed right, and I had a boss that went to different places and he ended up taking me. So I knew, I kind of like I knew who I was reporting to. I knew what I was in store for. Like I knew I had an opportunity. And I was just hungry, hungry for growth, hungry for learning. I think that's a big part of it is like being willing to learn.
Getting into your time in the MLS
Mhm.
now, obviously, I think since you've joined, there's been so much change and transition and kind of innovations that have come into the league. But when you first joined, or pre-joining, I guess
Yeah.
you could say, what were your expectations going in? What did you what was your idea of soccer in the US
Mhm.
as the MLS and so on? And then what became true of what your expectations were? What was false, and what were some like surprises along the way?
Sure. I think, first, soccer was my number one sport. That was my thing. I loved playing it, so there was that passion. So I always thought like no matter how stressed out I would get in a job, if I look to my left, I'm watching a game. That's not a bad thing. Um, so that was like part of the decision. Um, Also, like at the time, it was the beginning of the growth, right? Like the big growth, or not the beginning, but the big jump. Where they were adding almost two teams every few years, and it was making a lot of noise. So it was like, how do you? It's like a stock, right? How do you get in when it's low, and then it takes off? And I think that's kind of what I ended up doing is I got in at the right time. Now I will say, the last team I came for was a Major League Baseball team. It took a while. It was an expansion team as well, and we got it. When you leave, you get it to a point where it's singing, right? Like it's everything is moving on all cylinders. You're kind of a well-oiled machine. And then when you're kind of getting into expansion, like sure, you have some staff. We had some staff coming up. So I think the biggest thing was like resources. You just didn't realize how many people were doing how many jobs, and um, trying to keep things afloat, right? Like, and that's so you have to, you're looking at it a little bit differently. Again, getting back to that entrepreneurial thing, you're truly rolling up your sleeves. Like, there's no ivory tower, in MLS. I don't care what team you're working for. There's no ivory tower, right? Like everybody is doing multiple things, and my counterparts, and we talk about it, and we joke like how many steps, they'll be like, well, this weekend I did 6 miles or I did 10 miles at the game, like, and that's what you're doing, right? You're just running around
Mhm.
that building and looking and checking out different things and seeing what's going on. And so I would say like, so that probably like, I knew there was going to be a lot of that, but I think I underestimated how much. And you're also like, because it's probably like the growing, it's at the bottom of the food chain, so to speak. Young, everybody's young, hungry,
Mhm.
energy wise. Like boy, I mean, they get you moving. So you're kind of if you're a veteran in the business, like you're a teacher, you're a parent, and you're a boss, right? Like, so you're kind of doing all those things, and you have to understand that. And I think that's something I underestimated, but that I loved. Probably, I did not think about that part, and I think that part is probably the best part of it, because that energy level, just like kids, you want to hug them or you want to,
Keeps you young, right?
yeah, it sometimes keeps you young and sometimes gets you old,
Yeah.
just like kids.
We'll get into your role in a little
Mhm.
bit here, but what's the one part of your role so far, or one task that was like the biggest shock that like you were like, okay, I signed up for chief marketing officer and I'm doing something totally different. Like you mentioned, the kind of the multiple hats thing.
Yeah, I would say the greatest one that happened to me was in 2019. We made it to the playoffs, new building, opened up a new building, made it to the playoffs for the first time, and we wanted to do these like wristbands that light up, music, everything goes with it, built to in the building. And we made a late decision because we weren't sure if we were going to host, not host, what's going on, and then we pulled the trigger late, and of course these things got stuck in customs, and then they landed. We got the thing. They landed. This is on the same day of the game, right? And the game starts at 7, and I think they got to the building around 6:30, and we were running around trying to get these things to gates as the gates were open inside the building. I mean, and my son was there. He was he was helping because my wife wasn't feeling well and she left, right? Like, so he was like in, 8th grade at the time, and he is running around, he's carrying boxes, I'm carrying boxes, we're going to different things. And I was like, I sit down and I said to someone, I'm like, there's no way we got full coverage of this building. No way. And at halftime when they did it, I was like, holy cow,
It worked.
it worked. And then my son says to me right after we do it, he goes, that was fun. Do you guys do this every day? I'm like, no, we do not.
Hopefully not. Yeah.
I'm like, no, no one's going to survive that. But again, part of your job, you're handing out like wristbands for people, right? Like, because you want it to be successful.
Yeah, very well said. And it looks like you got a little intern there. It's perfect.
Like a little intern, with a little attitude at times, but yeah.
Yeah. Let's get into your actual role specifically.
Yep.
So you're chief marketing officer at Minnesota United. What does the sort of the day-to-day look like? What does that role actually mean?
Sure. So it's like a traditional chief marketing officer. What I mean by that is like you're overseeing like, the marketing, the merch, the digital, public relations, community relations, creative services, game presentation, video production. So you're kind of broadcasting. You're overseeing like the areas that fall underneath it for the most part. So a lot of it is just there's a lot of check-ins during the day with the people, like with your direct reports and staff, trying to see where these big projects / campaigns are going. Are they moving? And with soccer's like you have a kind of a long season, even though you don't have a lot of games, right? So it takes up a lot of time. So it's hard to get into like the next wave or next year. But that's what's key is constantly looking forward and trying to make sure that the planning is going to happen that you need to happen. So there's a lot of that, and a lot of meetings like everywhere else. I'm trying to see if I can, I told my department, I'm trying to see if I can install if we're going to do an hour meeting, it's going to be 45 minutes. That's it. We're going to be in that room for 45 minutes because they all go back to back, right? Like, so no one has time to like review their notes from the meeting, any action steps, even go to the bathroom, right? Like, so how do we kind of do that? But so I think it's my job to just keep things moving, and always look at the big picture, right? Like as a CMO, your job is, growing revenue and growing the brand, right? Like it's not one or the other. And it used to be, right? Like it would just be like, we're moving revenue, or we need to grow. No, your job is both. And the problem is that you don't always have the money for the growth side. You have the money for the revenue side. So you have to try to balance that. And in each sport, I think it's becoming more and more important because of what's at stake. With the sponsorship dollars and with the season ticket members and just people paying a lot of money for tickets. So you have to be buttoned up. And so it's kind of my job to make sure we're always looking ahead. How do you improve the fan experience, right? Like, how do you grow the brand? How do you take care of partners? All these different things is kind of like what you're trying to do. And you're trying to find like, what's going to be your lightning rod? How are you kind of getting there?
You mentioned when you first joined, it was kind of the beginning of that growth curve, or the really strong growth curve that we've had recently. We've had the likes of like Lionel Messi joining. You've had Leagues Cup. You've had a lot of these new expansions, the Apple TV deal. There's been a lot of new additions, like I mentioned previously. What has been the biggest sort of a contributor to that growth for you personally, like in terms of Minnesota United and the MLS as a whole?
Minnesota United, I think our biggest thing for growth was the stadium, right? Like I'll say that, like we played at University of Minnesota for 2 years on their football field. There was lines, there was this, there was that, right? Like it wasn't soccer, it wasn't, you know what I mean? Like, and I think when we stepped into the new stadium, it was like, it was beyond credibility, right? Like it was like they're real. It's probably one of the most beautiful stadiums in MLS.
Yeah, it's stunning.
I joke that it's our owner's summer home because that's how much time and detail they put into it, right? Like, and that's what makes it special. So I would say that was the number one thing for the team side of it. And unfortunately, the next year was COVID. So we make the playoffs, we have a new building, and then we come right back down to reality. I think the Apple deal has given us some credibility as well, especially with all the regional sports network issues and everything going on that side. So like at least you know where to find us, right? Like there's still some work to be done. The broadcasts are great, from that standpoint, but we still have a long way to go when it comes to that. And then you got Lionel Messi still playing like Lionel Messi, and that it hasn't benefited Minnesota United yet, and because we haven't played them since he's been in the league.
Yeah.
Now, where it does kind of get you is like where where you get like soccer people. Now they may be tuning in a little bit, even if it's not your game. Even they're still tuning in. Maybe they're just watching Miami. That's okay, because Miami, they're always playing somebody. It's kind of like that thing where like you always hear about scouts, and it was like, oh, I went there to watch this one guy, but this other guy caught my eye.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so you're hoping that that's what you're getting, right? When someone's tuning in and watching, they're not just tuning in for Messi. They're tuning in and be like, wow, the other team's pretty good. The other team's got some good players. And then maybe that brings them along, maybe that just changes the interest. The casual fan, like even my parents, right? Like they know, they're 80 plus years old and they know that Lionel Messi plays for Miami, right? Like they may not have known that before because they were more into like Serie A and just watching, the Italian soccer leagues for the most part, right? Like now it's a little bit different. So you get a little bit more credibility, especially since he's still playing very well. I mean, that doesn't hurt, right? Like, winning a World Cup, playing in MLS, like all those little things doesn't hurt the credibility of the league and the growth of the league.
You mentioned it a little bit there, but it's sort of like a rising tides lifts all, what is it? Lifts all boats, lifts all ships.
Yeah.
And I think you get that from something like Messi, like you mentioned. You also mentioned that like the NBA was a really good league at being able to do that, kind of everyone together. Mm-hmm. Do you see that across the MLS where in terms of like marketing and growth, you find that everyone can kind of collaborate and work together to do that all at once in that sense?
I think it's starting to get there, right? Like it's kind of like, when you're drinking water through a fire hose, so to speak, before, where it's kind of hard to think about that, right? Like think about like how to grow, and because you're swamped. But I do think people are realizing now that the growth for this league is the most important thing, right? Like I think MLS does an amazing job they have loyal fans, right? We have probably one of the greatest fan bases I've ever seen. Loud, but it's not huge. It's not, giant, right? Like, so how do we keep growing it? How do we keep getting people in? But you're also seeing it with like partners, right? When we first came in the league, it was very much of a community / passion play by partners. You have no analytics, you have no numbers that you're going by. You're doing potential, right? But then when it comes to renewal, it just comes down to facts and figures at that point, right? Like, are you getting the impressions that they want? Are you getting the clicks? Are you getting this? Are you getting that? Right? Whatever KPIs they're using to judge the sponsorship or the partnership, it's a lot different. And all that Moneyball stuff and analytics and everything, like that's just like the cell phone, so to speak. Like the genie's out of the bottle. Everybody knows how to use one, and everybody knows that there's information out there to say what has worked and what hasn't worked, right? And everybody's being judged by that. So there's enough numbers. So now it's up to us to be like, okay, how do we improve our numbers? How do we grow? How do we get the top of the funnel? Because everything is about the bottom of the funnel. Sales, 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 hitting our numbers, right? Like, I don't think anyone, I don't think I've sat in a room for like 2 hours and explained why we lost 10 people on X, right? Like, but you may be like, why didn't we hit the revenue numbers? And now you're sitting here explaining that, right? Like, so, but I do think the growth part is directly affecting the revenue part. It's like if you can double your fan base, don't you think you're going to increase some revenue?
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I would say on the sort of opposite side of that, when you have like these league-wide deals, salary cap, like everything is very franchise model, especially in some of the other leagues that you've worked in. How do you stand out in that regard? Because it can sometimes be difficult. You have very similar jerseys across the board. Everyone's wearing the same cleats. So you have a lot of the same things right across the board. So I'm curious how, as Minnesota United now, you can stand out from the competition.
Yeah, it just comes down to like what's your positioning? what are your brand principles, and then what's your why, right? Like our why is to promote soccer, right? So that falls underneath that. We have strong core values that we try to follow, use it kind of using as our decision making, principles, and then we try to be very authentic to, like, we look at it as to Minnesota, right? Like if you look at our kits, for the last like 6+ years, our kit has something to do with the natural elements of Minnesota, right? Because our logo itself is everything about Minnesota. I mean, you have the state bird with the loon, you have the Mississippi River cutting between the Twin Cities, you have the Iron Range, and you have the Northern Star, right? Like that's everything about our logo. So when we do something, our logo, our kit this year was called Starry Night, Minnesota Starry Night. So it's kind of a black kit with like a blue and it has stars on it kind of deal. And so when and that's only because like Minnesota nights are beautiful, right? Like the night sky is amazing. So we kind of build it around that. But then when we launch it, we always use the first month of the season to donate to specific charities that tie to that theme, right? Like year before we did Northern Lights, so we had a cool Northern Lights looking kit, and then we did a river kit, right? Like so, but we always try to find a connection, right? Like so because giving back's important, and then giving back to the environment in Minnesota is really important. So we try to be authentic. So that's kind of how we stand out. Like we position ourselves as a professional team from Minnesota. So what may work in Atlanta may not work here, right? It's not. We try not to do the cookie cutter, right? Like, and you'll find out quickly how it doesn't work based on your fan base and based on your culture and your the state itself. And when I did when I first got here and did all the discovery interviews to see where we were going and who we were and learn more about this thing, it was passionate about like the state itself and how much pride they took into the state itself. And then how inclusivity, right? Like they wanted everybody to feel welcome at games and things like that. Again, it was almost to the person, right? Like it didn't matter if it was a grumpy person or a very happy person. They still wanted everybody to feel like this was their home. So we try to build it towards that, right? Like kind of towards our core values, our why, and our positioning.
And when you speak on like the cultural education of actually like knowing what the culture is around a specific city or sport or so on, how do you manage to learn that? Because I know, like you mentioned, obviously you had like kind of the lead up interviews to that, but you've been in so many different markets and I'm sure completely different approaches to each one. So how do you actually go about first learning and understanding a market and then adapting and being able to actually make an approach on it?
Yeah, it's I think first and foremost is making sure that you know that you're not the expert. Right? Like, so are you actually listening, right? Being a good listener, and then interviewing the stakeholders, talking to stakeholders in different ways, just having casual conversations, like where, like I remember we were talking, I had met with some season ticket members and, they asked what type of game presentation, what's it going to be? I said, I said, you tell me. I said, soccer's driven by the fans. So you tell me, what are we doing? Right? Like, because it was about them, right? Like that's what makes this sport special, right? Like it's the entire environment is built off of them, and your job is not to mess it up, but to enhance it, right? Like so, if you see something, you try to be like, oh, that's pretty cool. Are they doing that every time? I think they are. So you keep an eye out for it, but you're just meeting with the key stakeholders, not just the important people, right? Like it's like everybody. Like you gotta, and what I mean by the important people, like I'm not just talking to owners. You want their point of view. Don't get me wrong, but in some markets they're not at every game, and some markets they they don't even live there. Some, I think, our most of 95% of our owners actually live here, right? So the state of Minnesota being authentic, being true to Minnesota isn't really important to them, and this team and this community matters to them, right? Like so. And I got that just through the conversations, right? Like when you're like, well, I'm from here and I grew up here. I'm from here and I grew up here. Like I live here and you're just like, okay, this matters, right?
Yeah,
and
people
then,
must love being here.
yeah, and even like people I hired moved back, right? Like They moved back home, so they want to be here. So our thing is we want to make sure we want to think big, you know, we want to, but we want to focus locally. We want to focus on like what matters to this. So kind of having like, you know, list, being prepared, having your questions. It's just like an interview, like if you're interviewing somebody for a job or doing what you're doing when you're interviewing, right? You have to be prepared. And then you have to be willing to listen of the things that you may not agree with, but you know nothing about. You're just like, oh, I don't want to do that, but it sounds like everybody does, you know, like, and then you take it from there and then you kind of build it from there. And then from that point forward, it's your job to be, you know, pushing the brand and protecting the brand and hopefully staying on course. But we are a challenger brand. So we try not to be cookie cutters with other teams. Like I think the thing that if you want to get under my skin the most, to be like, well, everybody else is doing it. Don't say that.
Yeah, but that's a good approach to have. I think it's key, especially in a market like this where it's just kind of outbreaking and getting out there. It's about, okay, how do we now identify ourselves differently compared to everyone else?
Yep.
I want to dive into 2026 and beyond. I think 2026 is a big year. Obviously, you've got the World Cup. You have, but I think the other big one is that Messi's contract is then up in 2026. So there's going to be a lot of change in the U.S. sort of soccer space as a whole, but specifically in MLS as well. And a lot of conversation has started now about, okay, the MLS has grown drastically, like you mentioned, since sort of 2016, and Messi's been a huge part of that. But how can they continue to grow and keep a high level of not only soccer on the field, but also the product off the field, like right across the board? So for you guys specifically, from your point of view, how do you plan on now a Messi-less league without Messi? How do you plan on continuing to grow in that space and using the World Cup, for example, in 2026 as a tool to continue to do so?
Yeah, you know, kind of gets back what I was saying earlier. Like we've put a pretty big plan in place for the next 3 years to like 27, right? About how to grow. And some of that has to do with Messi. Some of that has to do with the World Cup. A lot of eyeballs on the U.S. during that time frame. The last time the U.S., I think, hosted the World Cup, that's when MLS started, pretty much like a year later, right?
Yeah.
Like, so we're trying to build towards, you know, peak on peak, so to speak. So we are looking at that. As far as like Messi goes for us, for Minnesota, we're in the West, you know, and we haven't even played Miami in 2 years. So there isn't much that's going to affect us, right? Like when it comes down to it, where some leagues are like, we know that we're going to play them twice, so we're going to get a big rating spike in 2 games, and we're going to get a big, you know, money spike on 1 game, right? Like we don't even know if we're going to play them, so our plans don't necessarily build around Miami per se. So as far as like a Messi-less league goes, I think MLS is starting to turn into a selling league too, right? Like younger DPs, U22s, academy kids, right? Like, and that's important. Like when you're seeing like talent, you know, coming out of a league, that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing, right? Like I would use in a different example, like there were certain groups out there, let's say the Red Sox, they were really good at growing like sideline reporters on NESN. And then all of a sudden these NESN sideline reporters became national. They would go national. And I had a couple in baseball too, where it was like we were starting to get a reputation that if you worked for the Washington Nationals, there was a chance you can go national, right? Like as a sideline person or as this. And that's a same thing as like a selling league. Now all of a sudden you're going to have younger talent that's going to be looking at them and be like, if I go there, I have a good chance of getting here, right? So, and when you can do that at a, you know, whatever, 15 years ago, they called it the retirement league, the country club league, right? Where they would end your career. Now it's like you have guys coming over and they're starting their career here from different countries. And and they're good because they're actually realizing that you need to play to get better, right? Like you actually have to play in games. And that's, you know, and then people can see you. And then again, nice thing about the Apple deal, anybody can watch us. So scouts, families, different teams, there's an opportunity that it's easy to watch because it's on one location in that place. And then pretty much, I think, like whatever, 98% coverage in the world, like not a bad thing. Now, they still have to sign up for it, don't get me wrong. But if you really want to scout MLS, you can. And I think it's only going to improve because of that.
So you mentioned that recruitment side. Is that a conversation that you're having quite often, like speaking with the recruitment staff on, okay, what players are we potentially bringing in? What, like, how can we strategize sort of marketing campaigns around that? How are we using sort of our resources in terms of the salary cap to build on players, but also use that on kind of like the marketing side? Like, I'm curious how those conversations go about.
Yeah, we have a new group, and led by Khalid El Ahmad, and very very collaborative. A lot of conversations, a lot of meetings. He invites us to their quarterly kind of breakdowns. He's very transparent, and and what's nice about that is you see the planning, you hear the planning, you hear the thought process, and you could kind of work around it. Very much team, collective first. So it's not about putting one player on a pedestal and everything going around that player. So we still, we do the tier system, right? We have a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and we put certain players in each tier. And then from there, we try to, then I'll sit down, I'll send it to our CSO, Khalid, and be like, any issues with this, right? Like, it doesn't mean we're only going to focus on those players, but if it's something big, that's where we're focusing on those players, right? And we have different ones in there. And there's been times where he's like, I would move so-and-so up and so-and-so down. We may be trying to move so-and-so, so I don't want them tied to something that you're going to have to change. So I think there's a trust that you need. Like, you're not affecting who they're bringing in, so to speak. Like, sure, it would be great. Like, if you gave me 3 names and I looked at their things, of course, the first thing I'm going to look for, besides if they're good, is like, what's their social following and how's that going to help us grow, right? Like, but the biggest thing is just getting the right guys in the right position, with the right attitude and the right, understanding that, like, we are a market that cares about our fans, and our post game, we don't have to tell our players to go thank the fans. They do it. We don't have to tell. There's some of them we have to drag off the field, which is great because, like, there's a team meeting or something, right? Like, and that's what you want, right? Like, you want the players to be like, I haven't signed everybody. And, so as long as there's that mentality coming in, no matter how good you are, that you are part of a collective and you're part of a community. That's what matters.
What is the effect of, like, play on the field? So in terms of how well the team is doing, to off the field in terms of marketing and growth from your side? I'm curious, like, the actual, like, is there a huge effect on that, or is it fairly balanced? Like, I'm curious to hear more on that.
It's a little bit of both, right? There is an effect. Like, I'm not going to be that person who says, like, we don't, no. There is an effect. People are in a good mood, both in the office and fans. Everybody loves a winner. They talk about them more in the media, right? Like, but we don't build our whole plan around winning and losing, because you can't. It's almost impossible to, right? Like, so you still have a plan, but it just makes it easier. And sometimes that's when you can kind of hit the tipping point, when everything hits at the right time and you have a really good plan and the team plays well, right? Like, there's been times where, we've had great campaigns and you'd be like, this is going to be amazing. And the team's like the worst team in the league. And that campaign is never heard of, right? You're just like, it's all about timing. If you could kind of, get lightning in a bottle, with the wins, but the key is always being prepared for it. The one thing I would say, I'll kind of use the Chicago Bulls back in their heyday. The one thing I loved about the Bulls in their heyday is they didn't sit back and just focus on Michael Jordan and that's it, right? Like, they were still doing giveaways for every game. They were doing a lot more entertainment than most teams for every game, right? They had dance teams, they had interactive squads, they had drum squads, they had a mascot. So they were building this with or without Michael Jordan, so to speak. They were winning. And a lot of times you could have those, those leaders, those CEOs, those owners be like, let's just save the money. People are buying tickets. We don't need to. We don't need to do anything. But what that does is that sets you up for when Jordan leaves, right? Like, that sets you up for when Messi leaves for failure, because you've done nothing. So if you're playing well, how do you boost it, right? How do you make it bigger? How do you build off of that? So when you're not playing well, you still have, you have a lot of, you've built a lot of, like, value to your fans, that it's like, okay, They got a plan. They had a bad year. We still love them, kind of thing, right? Like, and that's what's crucial is keeping that kind of, I look at it as my job is to sell hope. We're always selling hope.
I like that. I've never heard of that. We were discussing the Club World Cup and then the World Cup, obviously back to back years from this summer. Minnesota not hosting in either competition. Is that a goal now to push into something like that? So post 2026, that can be a focus. And how do you kind of strategize and adapt when you're not a host city? Obviously, you mentioned the likes of like not having Messi in town, so you can kind of have different strategies. So I'm curious how you're strategizing around that.
Yeah, we're looking at different things from like watch parties, right? Like, how do do we use the stadium for it? Do we use, is there something downtown? Is there something big or a collective where where people can naturally gather and have big screens and turn it into a party? And so I think at least our goal with it is, we have hosted U.S. men's, U.S. women's games. Our stadium holds 20,000 for these type of events. I believe you need like 25 plus, and even more, right? So, our how do we still get in there? How do we still host games, of meaning, friendlies too, with the U.S. women's, U.S. men's. So we're still looking at stuff like that. We have an amazing stadium, amazing training ground for people, for these clubs to do it. But we are looking on the other side of the business, and it's like, how do we get a place that we can be the experts, right? Like, we're soccer's here, and maybe we're not doing all the heavy lifting. Maybe we're using partners and using the city and using all these things, but we're using our expertise, and our influence because this is where, this is our world.
And do you shift focus? Like I know you were mentioning earlier, the NFL does a really good job of having sort of even outside of the season, you have your concerts, you have your other events at the stadium. Is that maybe then a focus then as well during that time where you say, hey, we can't capitalize on a Club World Cup or the World Cup, but we can capitalize on other concerts, events, shows, whatever that might be at the stadium?
We'll definitely explore it, right? Like, we have a grass field in Minnesota. There's a small window of nice weather.
Yeah.
So you don't want the field to get, we've been very protective of the field because we want it to be an amazing playing surface first and foremost. But if there's long breaks and there's not going to be games, that will be definitely something, we're going to explore. We never rule anything out.
We'll get back into your career. Is there one mentor or like influential figure in your kind of career journey that has really just had like a major impact on you in either your personal life or on the career side?
I think first and foremost, I'm going to say my parents, right? Like, and my brother. So definitely on the family side. My parents they were not the rah-rah. They were not the ones pushing you. But they had your back, and you saw how hard they worked and how much they sacrificed. So you just, you felt like you were letting them down, kind of thing, right? Like, and I think that's maybe the Italian Catholic thing, that they have a really good way of guilting you into working harder. So that was, so I'm going to say that side. As far as like the workforce goes, there was one boss, Tom Ward, who I worked for him in Charlotte, Nashville, Charlotte, and Washington. So
Wow.
kind of every time he went somewhere, he would take me and he would give me a little bit more responsibility. And I think someone believing in you is probably the most important thing, is when someone believes in you. And there were times it was definitely fake it till you make it. Like I felt like I was reading like a how-to manual on certain things, right? And I seem to be a glutton for punishment. I think I've opened up 3 stadiums, arenas, so to speak, and like did 4 expansion teams, right?
Wow.
So you're kind of, each one you're starting at nothing. And you're hiring, like, it's like, okay, what kind of staff do I have? Like, no, you don't have one. You need to hire one. I'm like, oh, okay. So someone believing in you. And, I always said, if you hire someone that is hardworking, passionate, and high integrity, you just have to make sure they don't hurt themselves, because they're going to work harder than you'll ever push them, right? Like, they're going to feel like they're letting you down. And so if you surround yourself with good people, like, it's your job to protect them and have their back, right? Like, and that's the way that's what happened to me. And that, and that's what I'm trying to do for, when I, people that work for me.
So for people listening now that are, we'll stick with this sort of sports marketing, sports business as a whole, either trying to break into the industry like we spoke about for you earlier on, or just trying to excel their career in the industry. What's that one piece of advice? What's that one thing that you would sit down and tell them?
You know, I used to say to people, like, if you're an intern, if you get the shot, don't try to sell me your marketing plan. Move the box. And what I mean by that is, like, there's so much work to be done. Like, stop, it's like, stop walking around the work that needs to be done to do the sexy stuff. People actually notice the grind. I mean, at least I do. And when you see somebody who's grinding every day, and you want to be able to take care of that person, you're going to be like, if that person has been given a shot and they're doing everything they can to not lose it. So, and I think that gets lost. Like, I saw something with Tom Brady saying, like, sure, talent helps, but working harder than everybody else helps even more. And I do agree with that. Like, and actually it's easy. It's easier to work. It's easy to work harder than everybody else. Kobe Bryant used to talk about it. If people used to get up at 6, he would get up at 5, right? Like, it's those type of things. And I a lot of times people just don't want to do it. They want to go right to the sexy. And, I want to be the CMO. Well, I mean, I think it took me a long time to get to a CMO. And if I was basing it on when I became a CMO, I think my career has probably been pretty bad, so to speak, right? Like, because it takes long. It's not easy, right? Like, you're going to get discouraged and you're going to fail more than you're going to, be successful. Just like playoffs, right? I always say to my staff, enjoy it. I've been doing this a long time and I've been out of the playoffs more than I've been in, right? Like, so don't take it for granted. And it's the same thing, right? Like, the little stuff matters. Replying to people, sending thank you notes, following up, like, those things matter. That I think it's like a lost art. So if you can have a strong plan and figure out how to make your boss's job easier, you will be successful.
I like, there's a quote alongside that. I think it's similar to what you were saying. It's hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. And I think that's sort of what you're getting at. Just go and move the box instead of trying to build up a nice marketing plan. I like the idea of that. I think sometimes the simple things are the most important. For you now, heading into the later stages of a really expansive career in terms of experience and knowledge right across many different industries, what is the legacy that you want to leave behind? Like, what do you want to be known for?
Yeah. I hear that a lot, and we talk about these things, but to me, it's about relationships, right? Like, I don't think, like, when I look back on my career, I kind of laugh because, I don't remember all the things that were successful. I remember all the things that failed. And I think, but I laugh. Like, I used to I joke with my wife. It's like, it's those things that when you're going through it at the time, you want to cry. And then when you tell the story later, you're laughing because you're crying because it's so funny. You're like, there's no way that happened. No, it really did. It really did happen. So it's those relationships and, and hopefully that the way I like to leave my mark is like, did people work for me grow? And when I see people being successful in other markets and other jobs, that means a lot to me because it means that, maybe I had a good eye for talent, right? Like, and I see all these people growing. And I was telling this story yesterday to someone. There was a camera person in Nashville who was trying to get into it, right? He was trying to get into like a regular thing. And he was so positive. He was hungry. He was good at what he did, but he wasn't an everydayer, right? Like, he wasn't on that top list. And we were introducing a robotic camera. And our engineer at EIC said, "Who do you think can do this?" And I said, "I want so-and-so to do it. See if he's interested." And he did it. And I would say about 15 years later, 15 years, right? Maybe 20. He tracked me down on LinkedIn and he sent me a thank you note saying, "You saw something in me that no one else did." And that meant a lot, right? Like, that was just like, whoa. So if I can walk away with more of those stories, that's probably what I'd like to walk away with. It's not about, I mean, don't get me wrong, I want to win a trophy.
Yeah. But I think those stories are key as well.
Yeah.
we'll wrap things up here with some quick fire questions.
Okay.
The first one, what is one team, league, or organization that you potentially are looking to work for or want to work with? It could be maybe a partnership with Minnesota United that you've never worked with or worked for in the past.
Ooh. I don't know if there is one, but I would like to do something with Juventus. I think that's my soccer team in Europe, and it kills my parents because my mom is from Naples. So,
oh boy,
yeah. But I blamed her because I think when Juve won, some major tournament, my parents always used to go to San Gennaro's Festival in New York, which is the biggest Italian festival. And she came back with a Juve jersey. So it's like a little tiny one that you hang on it. So I blamed her. She goes, what did I know?
That's fair. Yeah. What's one vital part of your daily routine? Is there something that you do every day to just like get you inspired and keep you moving?
Yeah. Espresso.
Yeah. I like that. Okay.
Yep. Yeah. It's like a rhythm, right? Like, you get into kind of a routine of like taking the dogs for a walk, coming back, making the pot of espresso, sitting down for a few minutes. It's like, I look at it as like the calm before the storm, right? And I used to do the same thing when I played, a lot of times, maybe not the coffee side, but before I played a game, I used to get too hyped up. So I had to sit down, and people were thinking I was meditating. All I was trying to do was just like catch my breath and not like use all my energy. So like I try to, it's like kind of walk up music. I always say like some people like music to pump them up. I needed music to calm me down. So I think that's what it does for me in the morning, is that routine. And when I don't have it, people know.
I think Italians just have like espresso going through their blood. Like I think it's just a natural energizer.
Yep.
If you weren't in your current profession, if sports marketing as a whole wasn't ever the pathway that you went down, where do you think you would be?
Unhappy.
Yeah.
Like I don't know. You know what I mean? Like it's hard to say. I've always talked about like I'd love to have a restaurant. You know what I mean? But I know that's not easy. That's like really hard work too. So that's a tough one. I think I chose the right thing for me.
That's all you can ask for. And the last one here, if you could sit down with one person for a meal, past or present, who would it be and why?
Bob Marley. Great music, played soccer, great story.
I love it. That's a great way to end the episode. If you have any last words before we wrap things up, and then we'll head out.
No, I appreciate you having me on. And I've watched your stuff, and I think you do an amazing job. So thank you for doing what you do.
Appreciate it, John. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll speak soon, okay?
All right, sounds good. Thanks. Take care.
Have a good one.